Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all well on this Open House Melbourne weekend. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners and the original custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and to any other elders who may be watching this today. So hello and welcome. My name is Bridget and I'm joined by my colleague Sophie, and we're both from Burundara Arts. And we're so excited for you to all join us today with this talk called Inside Online at the Kew Courthouse. I'm also joined by my friends from the Kew Historical Society, Robert Baker and Judith, who are going to be with us today and helping us present this fantastic building to you all online. So 2021 is the 6th year that the City of Boroondara has participated in Open House Melbourne. And Open House Melbourne is a fantastic way to celebrate local stories by engaging the properties and the people that reside in them, to find out more about what makes these buildings so great. Just before we get started, so everyone, this is a webinar and the only people that can be seen and heard are the panelists. If you would like to engage with us, we ask that you please share your questions and your thoughts through the Q&A section, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. So this building, Kew Courthouse, is a part of 8 buildings which are opened as part of the City of Burundara's Open House Melbourne program. And the other buildings do include the former Hawthorn Tram Depot, the Hawthorn Arts Centre and Tay Cragen in Hawthorn, the Camberwell Civic Precinct, and the Limehouse Museum and Galleries in Kew. So this session will go for about an hour. We will have about a 30-minute presentation, and then there will be times at the end to go through your questions and comments and help find out more things. So with the presentation that Judith and Robert will be giving, please just ask the questions as you go through the presentation, and then we'll get to them at the end. So, as I mentioned, we're joined by Judith and Robert from the Kew Historical Society, and so I'd like to welcome them and thank them so much for coming along today and providing us with information about this beautiful building here, the Kew Courthouse, and the other complexes attached to it. So, Robert, Judith, we're in your hands. So, Robert, are you able to give us a bit of historical background of this complex?
I hope you can hear me, Bridget.
Sure can.
Thank you for your introduction. I want to start off by giving participants some background, which I hope will help them understand the context in which these late 19th century buildings were planned for and developed. The Kew Courthouse, or as it was originally known, the Kew Public Offices, are in the historic centre of Kew. If you're not familiar with the area, Kew is one of the inner middle suburbs of Melbourne, located to the east of the city centre. As suburbs within the city of Burundara, Kew and Kew East are bounded by the River Yarra in the east, by Barkers Road in the south, and by Burke Road in the west. The land, of course, was traditionally owned by the Wurundjeri people. However, the first Crown land sales were held in Kew in 1845, and they ultimately represented a dispossession of the original owners. 1845 was, of course, 10 years after the first settlement of Melbourne by John Batman, John Fawkner and their followers. In the first years following those Crown land sales, Kew, Hawthorn and Camberwell were part of a rural road district, what was then known as the Burundara Road Board. Now, we've got quite an interesting map here. It's one of the earliest maps in our collection, and it was done by one of the occupants of Kew, or the residents of Kew. But it represents Kew as it existed in the 19th century. Most of the streets in Kew near the junction, most of the streets in Kew are near the junction, and you can see them marked there in the very centre of the map. The main road, however, which diagonally crosses the map, is what was then known as the Bulleen Road. It's now known as High Street. The Bulleen Road was developed before the first official survey of Kew. It follows the contour of the landscape rather than a conventional grid pattern of streets, which you can see is developing to the north of the road. The same applies to Cotham Road, which branches off the Bull Road just west of the Kew Junction. It is the junction of these two streets, Bull Road and Cotham Road, at which the new Kew public offices were to be built. You can see on this later map from about 1903, the distinctive triangular shape where these two roads meet. And you can imagine how these might have influenced the design of the courthouse buildings when they were created. If you're looking at this area now, probably the most familiar item in this junction would be the Kew War Memorial, which is on the apex of the triangle. By 1860, the citizens of Kew and Hawthorn each sought and gained independence from the Road Board. So each municipality from 1860 to 1994 was governed by its own council. Most of the newly erected civic buildings in the cities were owned by these two councils, but many government services such as courts, police and postage were still separately managed by the Victorian government. But let's begin with postal services and what they looked like before these buildings were built. In the 19th century, postal services were initially contracted out. Doesn't sound very unfamiliar to us now, does it? And managed by a private operator. In the case of Kew, this was by a local pharmacist. The pharmacist was also the local representative of the Office of Births, Deaths and Marriages. This first Kew post office was in a wooden building, which you can see here on the same triangular site that we saw in the previous slide. We don't have a slide for the Old Town Hall, but I just need you to know that court cases were originally held in the first Kew Town Hall in Walpole Street. Newspaper reports during the 1860s record that the Court of Petty Sessions hired rooms in the Town Hall. This was a problem because the councillors and council staff couldn't use these hired rooms in the buildings even when the court was not in session. In contrast, the local Kew police were located well away from the centre of Kew. Since 1853, the police had been stationed at the western end of Studley Park Road. That's the area overlooking the Yarra and what is now Collingwood. While the richest families in Kew lived along Studley Park Road, most of the population growth was occurring to the east along High Street and Cotham Road. Now, if we can move to the article, Bridget, taking these three factors into account, in the 1880s, when Victoria and Kew were experiencing what we now call the land boom, a civic campaign began for new public offices to be built in Kew. This campaign aimed to unify locally three functions of the Victorian government: the postal services, the police, and the court system. They were quite cunning when the Kew Council actually went to the Victorian government, and their major argument was to do with economics. And they said, or this press report said, by the creation of a combination public building, the business of the various departments would be greatly facilitated, and the expense would not be anything like what it would be for the construction and maintenance of separate offices in various parts of the district. So you can see they're putting an economic argument there, but they're also talking about utility and functionality. Now, as a result of all these deputations and petitions, plans were approved in 1886 for the building of the new public offices in Kew. The location chosen was the site of the old wooden post office at the junction of Bulleen and Cotham Roads. Building was commenced in 1887, and after 1 year, the buildings were opened. This is one of the earliest photos of the new public offices. It shows the post office section of the complex with postal staff, police and judicial staff standing in front. Cooperation in action. The three buildings, the police station, the courthouse and the post office, were held in public hands until this building you can see here, the post office, was sold by the Commonwealth Government in 1992. Now you may wonder why it was sold by the Commonwealth Government rather than the state government. It's simply that in 1901, all postal services and all postal buildings were transferred to the Commonwealth at the time of Federation. So the buildings were split. Courthouse remained on one side, still owned by the Victorian government, and the post office was transferred to the federal government. Now, the police station and the courthouse were held by the Victorian government until about 2007, when they were offered for sale by the Victorian government to the city of Burundara. We might ask why they were sold. One is that the old police station was getting too small for modern police services. The other reason was that the courthouse had closed about 10 years earlier. So Bridget, I hope this background prepares viewers for looking in more detail at the buildings and how they functioned. So I'll pass over to you and Judith at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. It really does give us some, understanding of why such a building was needed in Kew, especially this side of the river from Melbourne. Like, this town was booming by the time that this was needed for the community. And it's just a real demonstration of what, like, community and civic services being built in areas to support the community. So Judith, this building is such a recognisable site to the Kew Junction. Can you provide us a bit of understanding on, about the design and the build itself?
Yes, well, this building, it looks quite large and impressive from this angle in particular, but it's perhaps not really as grand as the Hawthorn Town Hall, which we saw if you were able to visit virtually at the session earlier today, nor even as large perhaps as some of the grand mansions, such as Tay Cregan, the building on the left, which is also being open for Open House Melbourne. So why is our building or our buildings regarded as being special, and why was it built in the style that it was? Robert's alluded to the fact that this triangular site was really quite tight. So they had to put buildings on which would be accommodated in a rather unusual site. From here, you can see the complex of buildings. We have the police station on the left. The courthouse is the building with the little tower, which I'll mention again later, in the middle. And the building without so much white stucco, right to the right of the image, is the post office that Robert's described. They're special for a number of reasons, and perhaps they could be summarised in the words of the citation for their mention on the Historic Buildings Register from Heritage Victoria. Now, we're not going to deal with the post office, this building on the right today, not as far as the architecture goes. It was, as Robert says, it was sold by the Commonwealth Government to private enterprise, and it's now a restaurant called, appropriately enough, the Postmaster. But the citation begins, the former Kew Post Office, together with the courthouse and police station, is important because it exhibits diversity in integrating civil offices, and because the design accommodates the apex of that road junction between Cotham Road and High Street. It was unusual also to have all three of those functions carried out on the same site. Might have been seen as an economic necessity, but not very many complexes like this were built in Victoria, and very few remain. The buildings demonstrate a departure from the favoured building styles of Second Empire, such as Hawthorn Town Hall, which we saw in a previous slide, or High Classical, and they were sort of being migrated almost to a different style altogether, known as Queen Anne style. Now, that image of Tay Cregan is probably Queen Anne style at its peak, but so is this building. And some of the features of that style include decorative brickwork, the red brickwork, plaster detailing in that stucco work, the steeply sloping slate roof, and what was described as an elegantly finished flèche or spire. That's the small whitish coloured spire in the middle of the courthouse. Who was the architect for this complex of buildings? Pictured here is one of a number of original plans, now we believe held in Public Records Office of Victoria. These coloured plans were created by the architects of the complex, George Watson and his deputy, John Henry Harvey, who worked for the Public Works Department. This department was responsible for the building of government and public buildings across Victoria. So really the major design and building authority for buildings belonging to the state government. These included a couple of other buildings that we know quite well in Kew, and you may have seen, or you may even have visited one of them for Open House Melbourne. This is what was the Kew Asylum, now known as Willsmere, and also Kew State School. So those same two architects, Watson, who was quite prominent, and Harvey, who sort of followed in his footsteps, but was a very skillful designer and architect. And a few of the features of the buildings that I've just mentioned, so Willsmere and Kew Primary School, actually show up in the buildings that we're looking at here. Things like that little decorative flèche, it's called. Flèche means arrow in French. So it's quite a small, very pointed spire. And we'll see later that it's functional as well as being decorative. Now, those buildings have three quite distinct sections. The central part, which is the one part we'll look at in more detail in a moment, is the courthouse. And within that, there are several more sections, including the large courtroom, as well as offices for the magistrates and officers of the court. The courthouse was entered from the street by a number of doors. You may be able to see that there are several doors along that frontage. One was for the general public and another was set aside for the magistrates and court officials. So you can see from where those arrows are, the one further to the right is the public entrance, and the other one, the public and the magistrates, were very separate classes of people. Certainly the prisoners were very separate again. Behind the space occupied by the courthouse, there was a large courtyard which linked the three buildings. Here's another of the plans from the Public Record Office, and you can see that triangular shape there. There we see it better when we zoom in. This central area was a courtyard linking all three buildings. So the post office to the apex of the triangle, the court building, the one at the bottom of the image, and the police station on the left. The open sloping space of the courtyard allowed prisoners to be delivered to and from the police cells. Mail could also be collected from and delivered to the post office, and officers of the court could leave the building via the courtyard to Cotham Road, to the south of that courtyard. Here are two different views of the same part of the courtyard as it existed in the past, and one on the right, more or less how it looks today. The first photograph shows that it was open to the air. I think this image must have been taken while it was in process.
Yeah, I think it was taken pre-renovations, just before it, I think. Yeah,
I think so, because they were either installing or taking out some perhaps ceiling fans, which seemed to be propped against the wall. But you can tell from the angle of the sun that is all open to the sky, really. But you can see that the veranda on the right existed. The one on the image on the right shows that it's been all roofed over. That white area of ceiling would have been where the original veranda was. So the roofs closed it in, and that area, the part with the red carpet, now serves as the foyer to the theatre, which we'll also see in more detail in a moment. Can we just flick back to the previous slide for a minute? That one, Bridget,
Yep.
thank you. When the renovations occurred after the sale of this whole site to the city of Boroondara, the architect, Peter McIntyre, very prominent local architect, still living in Kew, I believe, he had to solve the problem of levels. Now, you can't see very clearly, but there were 3 different levels associated with one with each of those buildings, so that the doors from the post office, the police station and the courthouse all came in at different levels. These days, of course, that area needs to be accessible, including by wheelchairs, prams, trolleys and so on. So the floor level linking parts of each part of the present day complex, apart from the unavoidably sloping ramp down to the cell block, had to be made all on the same level. Just have a glance as we're looking at that image again on that wooden railing and bench on the red carpet area there. We'll see that again in a moment in a completely different situation. So if we now go to the courthouse, this is what was originally the courtroom. Now it's been transformed into a theatre known as the Just Theatre, but in the past it was very different. You'll see in some later slides many of the original architectural features which could be preserved and used again in the in the restored theatre. Well, this room is really just like a huge hall, has a high coffered wooden ceiling, handsome woodwork lining the walls in red pine and Oregon, and it was lit by those quite tall windows which face onto High Street. You can perhaps just see there, and we'll see in a moment, that they have rather lovely lead-like glass, very simple formal pattern. Many parts of the room have been preserved, but others have changed, in particular the furnishings. So we see now a couple of images of that room in the course of its renovation. The one on the left shows the room looking towards the Magistrates Bench, and the other one looks in the opposite direction, so towards the public entrance, where the public gallery was located. So the Magistrates Bench was this wooden structure up a small flight of stairs. That's now been turned into a stage very appropriately. At the other end is where the public, as well as potential witnesses, could enter the courtroom through that central door at the rear of the room, and that was accessed by a narrow passage which came in from High Street, one of those doors, the door on the right that we saw in that plan of the building. The gallery, the public gallery, was separated from the court itself by a wooden partition and seating, and that's what's been moved out into the new foyer, the bit of rather handsome woodwork that we saw as a bench and panelling in the previous slide. Now, a bit about the the cases that were heard here. They were mainly those dealing with petty crimes such as public brawling, straying animals, cases involving captured escapees from Kew Asylum, and licensing issues related to the many hotels. Occasionally, more serious cases were heard, such as one we know of attempted murder, although sentencing generally occurred at the Melbourne Magistrates Court. The local magistrates were usually dignitaries, such as former mayors of Kew, who had been appointed as justices of the peace. The main body of the courthouse, of the courtroom rather, was occupied by quite a bit of furniture, including a high witness box, clerk of court's desk, and that raised magistrate's desk that we can see across the back of the photograph on the left. It is a large room, but you can imagine what it might have been like in a traditional court session. Public would be crowded together at the back, fenced off from the main part of the court, not socially distancing in the sense that we understand it these days. I'm quite sure they were socially distanced by their status, but everybody crowded in together if they were coming to hear or be witnesses to a court case. In front of them would be police officers, court officials, and prisoner or prisoners, while the magistrate sat at that elevated desk that we can see in the middle of the left-hand photo. Again, looking at those windows in the 19th century, they would have been one of the only way of providing light during daylight hours and at night or in dull weather by gas lighting hanging from the ceiling. Some of the other architectural features show us how the court would have functioned. And you can think about how that building might have felt during high summer or winter. Think of what the day might be like today. And this fireplace would have been the only way of heating that room. And, but of course, the room is now centrally heated, but that fireplace was very conveniently, it's a beautiful fireplace, it was very conveniently located much closer to the magistrate's desk than it is to where the public would have been. On the other hand, in summer, that room could have been unbearably hot, especially when it was filled with all the people at a hearing. So those lead-like windows were able to be opened to allow fresh air to enter the room. And in addition, there's a huge ornate vent in the centre of the wooden ceiling, that sort of triangular piece in the middle of the ceiling, which is just partly obscured by the modern day lights. But that vent was designed to remove stale air from the room, which was probably highly necessary. Air would have risen through that vent to the roof cavity and was then channelled out through that flesh tower that we spoke about before. And you saw from the when we were looking at the building from the outside, and here it is again. Looks as if it's had a slight lean to the very top bit, perhaps a very large possum landed on it. I'm not sure. That image is taken when the flesh is in the process of being renovated, as you can see from the scaffolding. Some of the furniture from the old courtroom has been preserved, including the Magistrates Bench, which is now located in Hawthorn Town Hall. The Clerk of Court's desk is in another part of the courthouse, and of course that railing, which was the barrier between the public gallery and the main part of the court, which is now in the foyer. So I hope, Bridget, that gives people a bit of an overview of the architecture and the design of the buildings and how it has evolved over time, changed with changing needs.
Yes, it has. But one thing I love about the Kew Courthouse is like you're in the theatre and you could imagine what it was exactly like. Like there's not much that has changed in that room, which is absolutely beautiful, especially those stained glass windows in a late afternoon when that sun pours in. It's just really gorgeous. And the fireplace I know has inspired work before, working with a local artist, and he developed a little play around and he was like, oh, around the fireplace. So yeah, it's a pretty inspiring place.
Yes.
So the other significant part, obviously, of the building is the police station. And Robert, are you able to share us a little bit about the police station and its functions during its time? Oh, Robert, you're on mute. There's always one a meeting.
Sorry, Bridget. When we think of a police station today, we think of offices, meeting rooms, and cells. But the old police station in High Street is a bit different. And it's really, while it has shared architectural features with the rest of the block, it looks like quite a discrete building. This is a view of the police station from High Street. It actually looks a bit like a house. And the reason it looks like a house is because that was what it was designed as. It was a home for the sergeant of the police station and his family. And unlike the other public offices, it is set back from the street and originally had a fenced off garden. It has 2 stories with a central hallway and staircase. Unfortunately, we don't have any photographs of the interior during the time when it was used as a residence. Now, behind this building were the offices used by the police force and also a cell block at the very back. Later, when it was no longer fashionable to house police and their families on site, this whole building was taken over by the police. If we go on to the next slide, please, Bridget.
Yep, it's fallen asleep. Here we go. There you go.
We're lucky to have the support of the Victorian Police Museum, who have fantastic resources and have loaned them to us for this presentation. They've sent us a number of documents, newspaper articles, and photographs of police staff working at the station. The documents include the names of all of the sergeants who worked at the station and include the records and photographs of many of the officers who worked there. I haven't included pictures of the officers, but they look very like pictures of the criminals. They're all standing in front of a board holding up a number so they can be identified. Many of these photographs were taken in early 2002 when the police were vacating the building. And you can just see in this last slide here, there's a photograph of all the policemen and policewomen who were working at the police station just before it closed. However, even though the police had access to a number of buildings, there was also clearly a need for modernisation. And if we could look at the building, some of the offices and some of the outbuildings, you can see that. The external toilets are an example of this. And one can imagine how a complex designed to meet the needs of men were able to meet the needs of women at the station, let alone users today, who include people with disabilities who require specifically designed amenities. So it's a bit like the government house in Canberra that they're talking about. If you've been watching the ABC series where they talk about there being no toilets for women in the old Parliament House. So the first female parliamentarians didn't have access to any kind of toilet facilities and they had to run home if they wanted to use the toilet. Mm. Well, the police station and courthouse complex was a bit like that. And you can see on the right, just one of the rooms there. One of the interesting parts of the history of the police station is the story of its ghost. And I'm often asked about that, even though I've never seen it. Now, the ghost of the courthouse or the police station is referred to in a number of newspaper articles. Newspaper articles are need to sell issues. And so it was a catchy story that people like to read about. And it was part of the social history of the building. And this is an example of a story here on the left. And the story, according to Senior Sergeant Ron Sinclair, is that, and I'm quoting here, 5 or 6 years ago, a policewoman on night shift who knew she was alone at the station saw someone on top of the staircase. I think he means at the top of the staircase. Just in case people thought this was a policewoman's fantasy, the sergeant was able to corroborate it. This is what police do, is they gather evidence. Then about a year ago, the sergeant was alone in his upstairs office, typing at his desk. He senses the presence of someone behind him, thinking, how did he get in? Sinclair turns, but nobody was there. Then something, like the sheerest lace cloth, floats across the wall, follows the contour of the fireplace and disappears out the door. Now, the police who worked at the station believe that this was a ghost of a former policeman who died in the station. Neither Judith nor I have had the benefit of witnessing the apparition.
Shame.
Great shame. Originally, the police officers and their cells were located at the rear of the police residence, and the cell block was accessed through the rear courtyard. The entrance to the block was through a metal screen and door, and it was really good that the renovations kept that screen and door, and while I say it's a metal screen, they'd be impossible to break through in the 19th century at least. Now, the block contained 3 cells of different sizes, and you can see the doors to those cells on the right-hand slide. Each originally had a bed and a toilet. The doors were heavy metal-plated doors, and they included a small viewing window, so the prisoners could be checked on. Some of the old doors include graffiti, and I'm glad Bridget hasn't been able to get a picture of those because some of it's quite rude. And they were written by the prisoners when it was still operating as a cell block. And one of the cells is set up as it might have once looked. And I'd have to say to you as viewers, this presentation on Open House Melbourne had a number of versions. Bridget, Judith and I were convinced that we were going to be taking you through physically on a guided tour. And then we had a plan to take you through using the virtual tour, which had been developed. But we didn't have access to that when we were writing this, so we had to revert to slides. Now, there are many interesting stories about the prisoners who were locked up in these cells. And some of them are quite recent stories. Of course, the prisoners ranged from accused murderers that Judith talked about to those committing petty crimes. And I had the pleasure of meeting an elderly visitor to the courthouse earlier this year. And he lived in North Balwyn at the time, and his parents operated the first supermarket in Kew. He was apparently caught by the local police when he was caught borrowing his father's car while he was still a teenager. And at night time, caught by the local police and taken to the police station. The constable, who knew his father quite well, telephoned him, and his father, who was a very old-fashioned father, told the police constable to lock up his son for the night to teach him a lesson. This happened, and I was really pleased to be able to take this elderly visitor down from our rooms on level 1 to visit the cells on this ground floor.
Trip down memory lane.
Now, I think I'm going to pass over to Judith at this time.
Well, I was just going to add too, because the virtual tour you can take a walk actually into the cells if you visit the Kew Courthouse page on the Open House Melbourne, which I highly recommend you do because it's a great view and you feel like you're actually in the cell itself. So definitely check that out after this session. But Judith, you were going to talk about how it came to be what it is now, the Kew Courthouse, and it's a hub for community. So I'll just get you to turn your mic off mute as well. There we go.
Yes. Yes, well, this was a major campaign in the early 2000s. And the role of the Kew Historical Society, which both Robert and I are members, was fundamental in raising people's awareness that there was a severe threat because the state government wanted to sell this whole complex. And who knows what might have happened to it if that had occurred. So under the baton really or the banner of the Kew Historical Society, there was a huge fundraising effort to support the purchase and restoration of the whole complex, bar the post office, of course. The Save the Courthouse campaign was able to raise $500,000, which was a very large amount then, really, towards the restoration after the city of Boroondara had purchased the complex from the state government in 2007. This is an image with quite a number of prominent Kew members of Kew, other historical societies, Kew Historical Society, somebody who acted as the town crier for quite a lot of civic events, and I believe Peter McIntyre, the architect responsible for the redevelopment and restoration, is standing in the middle, likewise several councillors battling on this Save Kew Courthouse campaign. And the whole campaign is a reason why Kew Historical Society is a tenant of the building, using 2 of the upstairs rooms for our ongoing exhibitions and small amount of office space, and also access to the theatre, the Just Theatre, that was the courtroom itself, where we hold 2 public lectures a year. So the police station was renovated with the rest of the complex between 2007 and 2011. The idea was to restore it as closely as possible to the original design, and we've seen some of those images showing how very many of the features, such as the wooden staircase going up from the front door of the police station, was retained. Courtyard was retained, although roofed over, and of course the courtroom itself, becoming quite a magnificent small theatre holding about 80 people. And the idea was to put all these rooms to new community uses. Kew Historical Society uses 2 rooms upstairs, and we can see one of those rooms now here for our regular ongoing exhibitions and to meet the public, to have small functions, generally for launching an exhibition. Our current exhibition, which I should mention, and here it's featured, it's called Outdoor Leisure Activities, and it has quite a lot of treasures from 3 historic sporting clubs in Kew, which come under one sort of umbrella, organisation, but the sports were lawn bowls, tennis and croquet. So items, as you can see in some of these images, include pictures, trophies, pennants, plaques, and this also gives you an idea of one of these rooms. These were the rooms which would have been the upstairs rooms of the police sergeant's home. So there's a fireplace, as you can see. There's a matching room on the other side of the hallway, also with a fireplace. And we use one for really an open exhibition, which is open all the times that the building is open, and the other is for our more treasured and original material. That's this room that you're seeing here. So that's a locked room, and we staff this room only for 4 hours a week, unfortunately, because we're volunteers. So we have a team of volunteers who open that room for public exhibitions on things about people, places, events, mainly, of course, in Kew. We're grateful to the City of Boroondara for providing us with this space. And our opening times, which I will mention for when we're open again, not too distant future, we hope, a Friday and a Saturday between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. So we hope you'll be able to visit us again before too long. The 4 rooms on the ground floor of the police station are occupied by an organisation called Kew Art, which supports artists with physical and intellectual disabilities. And a gallery and shop display there and sell their artworks. You can see some of those on the left-hand side. And really, they create most beautiful lampshades and prints and cards and pottery, and it's well worth a visit. On the right-hand side, I think there's an opening of an exhibition that we were holding, possibly to launch our book about the mayors of Kew, which we did in 2018. Upstairs, 2 other rooms besides the KHS rooms are used by Emotion 21 Dance Company, a for-purpose charity providing dance and fitness programs for children and young adults with Down syndrome. They're now part of the Inclusion Foundation. So Emotion 21, which was formed in 2009, aims to enhance the lives and change perceptions of Down syndrome through dance, fitness and performance. So those are images showing some of the community uses of this whole complex. So Bridget, we thank you and the city, and Sophie and the City of Boroondara for allowing us to make this presentation.
Thank you.
Not as exciting as a face-to-face tour would be, and we hope we've provided viewers with some interesting aspects of the importance of these heritage buildings.
Yeah.
And of course, we hope that you as the public will be able to visit Kew Courthouse in person when regulations allow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, fingers crossed we can all be together on site this time next year.
Yeah.
So thank you, Robert and Judy, for that really informative presentation. I always think that the Kew Courthouse is such a little building when you think about it, in the grand scheme of things of other sites which are opened up at Open House Melbourne, but I think it's got such an interesting history, but also too probably one of the most well-recorded histories with those beautiful maps and images and things like that. And it's great to have the support of the Victorian Police Museum as well. And also to just a very big shout out to Robert and Judith. This happened within 4 days this week. And it's just such a fantastic effort and presentation. I always do really enjoy working with you and putting this stuff on. So thank you once again for giving that presentation.
Thank you, Bridget. your technical support in particular.
Well, yeah, talking about technical support, I might pass on to Sophie because we did have a couple of questions throughout the session. So Sophie, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Judith and Robert. That was such a thorough presentation and we've got lots of thank yous here. One question we do have though, what was the purpose of the flash tower?
You want me to answer that one?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, it was when the court, I mean, it's decorative, so it was part of the artistic appearance of the building, but it was hiding the fact that there was a vent. Instead of having a nasty looking little metal tube which was taking all that hot air out, they disguised it, I guess, and also it would have directed the air more effectively from that courtroom out through the ceiling, up through that vent. A modern, a 19th century form of air conditioning, I guess.
Range hood.
Yeah.
What was it?
Yeah,
a range hood?
A range hood, yeah.
Without a switch to turn it on.
Oh, wow.
Wonderful, thank you. Again, heaps of thank yous in here. If anyone else does have a question, you've got another minute or two to pop it through. But thank you so much, Judith and Robert.
Well, yeah, thank you once again. I might just do a couple of thank yous just in case anyone wants to ask a question. Thanks, Robert and Judith and the Kew Historical Society. As mentioned, they are on site and are generally, normally pre-COVID normal, whatever, open Fridays and Saturdays, but you also can visit their website, and if you do have questions or don't want to reach out to them, please Google Kew Historical Society and you'll get their wonderful website. Also too, that there is other sites open across Burundara this weekend, and as mentioned, we've got a virtual tour for Kew Courthouse, and there is also one for the Hawthorn Arts Centre, but I do know that Limehouse Museum and Galleries, and as well as Tay Cregan, have some, I think they have live sessions tomorrow, so you should tune into that. And also to former Hawthorn Tram Depot does have some content online as well, which you can check out. And speaking of Open House Melbourne, just want to thank them for their ongoing support to support us this weekend, and also to having us a part as a precinct partner. It's always fantastic to work closely with them. Thank you, Sophie, for being such a technical whiz and support throughout all the sessions. Thank you. I could not have done this without you. And also too, we would, if anybody here listening has a story or history about Kew or the Kew Courthouse and would love to share it with us, I'm going to be sending out an email just with a short survey. So feel free to, if you've got any more questions or want contact details or want to share your history about Kew, maybe you were locked up in a cell once in there, Robert would love to know. So please do that. Yeah, so thank you once again. Enjoy your Open House Melbourne weekend, and hopefully we'll see you in person at the Kew Courthouse next year. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Bridget.